Good evening, I'm Laurie Johnson. Welcome to Houston Public Media's web series, Political Perspectives. Every week, I'll be joined by show commentators Aiyer and Brandon Rottinghaus to discuss all things political. Tonight, we'll continue the conversation from Red, White, and Blue about the 2016 Iowa Caucuses. So let's get started. Jay and Brandon, one of the first things I wanted to just get out of the way is, what is a caucus? How is a caucus different from what we in Texas do, a primary?
They're similar. It's a question of effort in this case. It's probably like the distinction between egg salad and chicken salad, right? It's similar in idea, but slightly different in execution, right? So primaries are basically where people go and vote, and this is a pretty simple. You show up to the ballot box and you cast your vote. Caucuses require you to have to actually sit there and you have to participate. And so it's a different burden that is put on people, for good or for bad. So you have, depending on which caucus you're in, Republican or Democrat, you're going to have an effort to be able to sit and make a speech or listen to a speech, possibly change your mind at the moment. For the Republicans, it's a secret ballot. For the Democrats, you have a standard of 15% that you have to get to. If you don't get to 15% in that particular caucus, then they re-caucus. And so with a few number of potential candidates, it's not a big deal. With a lot of candidates, it creates a lot of conflict and lots of chaos. So this slightly different. The other thing is that there are serious differences between the people who go to caucus and the people who go to primary. And so the people who go to caucus tend to be slightly older, they tend to be more wealthy. And so in Iowa in particular, this is going to be a pretty meaningful difference between who might win and who might lose given that.
Right. It takes a huge commitment of time, right? Normally in a primary, you're in the ballot box, you vote, and you're sort of in and out 15 minutes, 20 minutes, depending on how long. This is hours at night. So it's at least a 2 to 3 hour process. It tends to be weather dependent. If the weather, it's on a Monday night. It could be raining. It could be snowing more likely in Iowa, and you're meeting in a community center or someone's house, depending on the size of the precinct, and so you're there for a while, and so it requires that. So one of the problems, to Brandon's point, is it tends to get a different cross section. So younger people tend not to go. Folks who just, younger families, you've got kids at home, you don't want to leave. So it really draws out a different demographic. It tends to draw out sort of the most conservative and the most liberal of each party. And so you get a polarization effect in caucuses that you don't always see in primaries. And it's one of the reasons why we're seeing sort of the candidates that seem to be doing well.
So how important is Iowa in the grand scheme of things? I mean, it's not an enormous, hugely populated state. Does it really matter if you win the caucuses?
It matters, for some and not for others. I mean, some years it's been influential and some years less so. This begins actually in the 1980s when the candidates who ignored it didn't do that well. So famously, Ronald Reagan ignores Iowa very early, and George H.W. Bush decided to participate more frequently and ended up winning. So investing time in Iowa matters, and that can be used to parlay towards future goals, but it's not always a perfect predictor of your future success.
Right. I mean, I always tell people that when you think about Iowa, it matters more in one party than the other. It's historically mattered a bit more on the Democratic side than on the Republican side. I think the last few winners of the of Iowa from the Republican Party haven't gone on to win anything. On the Democratic side, you see a slight difference. It was a huge springboard for Barack Obama in 2008. In 2004, John Kerry became the nominee in large part because of his surprise win in Iowa. And obviously in 2000, you had Al Gore winning, not just there, but in New Hampshire. But you want to view them together. If you view Iowa and New Hampshire together, their momentum swing that it can give a candidate can be significant. And so that's really what you want to look at it for. It's building momentum, building organization, because it's set up to allow a more organized candidate to be successful. It's one of the reasons, and to Brandon's point, you have to invest a tremendous amount of time. If you don't invest time, you tend to not be successful, which is what makes the polling so hard to predict, because you have to know who's coming out. It also makes it surprising how strong someone like Donald Trump is, because he's probably spent the least amount of time in there on the ground in terms of organization.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Ted Cruz has spent a lot of time in Iowa, as much as any other candidate. He's visited all 99 counties in Iowa, and it doesn't look like a big state. Not a lot of people live there. A lot of livestock are there, but not a lot of people. But to take 99 counties is a lot of effort, and this is good for him because there's an optics to it that gives him a credibility in campaigning the Iowa way, which he's challenged
Right.
Trump on. But what it does take away from is the fact that he's campaigning in places where there aren't a lot of voters, right? Where literally the number of cattle outnumber the number of voters. And this is charming because it's Iowa and it's the Midwest and this is the first in the nation, but it's also complicated because as a candidate, your whole objective is to strategically choose where you go. And for Cruz and company, they have to really think carefully about where they're going to go, how they're going to invest their time. So this is really the million-dollar question.
Yeah, I'm not sure Ted Cruz has visited every county in Texas, much less every county in Iowa.
That's right.
So do y'all want to look into your crystal ball and make any predictions for what we're going to see coming out of the caucuses?
Yeah, I would say I think that the polling is probably a little bit inaccurate, and my sense is that historically what you found on the is that the most organized candidates are successful. I would say that based on what we've seen in terms of that Ted Cruz is probably in a strong position to win it. The whole question is the intensity of support of supporters for Donald Trump. If he manages to win with very little ground game there, it would be there would probably very likely be a cascading effect throughout the rest of the primary. So that's where the momentum thing comes in. I think what you might see is that who finishes third and how close the third place finisher is to second could be really important. Because a lot of it is how you present yourself in terms of winning. And that can have a huge effect. If someone like Marco Rubio gets extremely close to, say, Donald Trump or Ted Cruz in terms of finishing third, that candidate, he could suddenly springboard himself up in New Hampshire, and then that could take off. You've seen that effect happen before. But yeah, I would get if I were going to lay money on that side, I would definitely say that. And then on the Democratic side, I think Clinton is going to be successful in Iowa for this very much the same reason, unless there is a surge of turnout. It's hard for Sanders to win.
Yeah, I mean, Jay and I are academics, so I'll give you the academic answer, which is maybe. A little bit of both. I mean, it depends, I think, on who turns out, right? So it's often contingent. In fact, polling has showed that if you have a big surge in terms of the number of people coming, then Sanders does much better than Clinton, or better than he otherwise would. And if you have a large turnout, almost record turnout on the Republican side of things, then Trump does much better. So we will see what the conditions look like on the ground in Iowa. We were just talking about how that matters, and I think Jay's exactly right. If it's cold and wintry and blustery, this is going to be a complicated scenario for getting people to the polls, and you might see the traditional up-the-middle candidate doing better. The other thing, too, is that it's about expectations. And if the expectation is that you're going to come in first or second and you don't, then that shatters this myth. And I think for Trump, this is a huge effect where if it looks like the tarnish is going to create this potential problem down the line for him, then it could end up hurting him. For Hillary Clinton, if the bloom is off the rose and all of a sudden she looks like she's beatable, then it's a whole new ball game. So this is part of this bigger picture, as Jay said. It's a 1-2 punch between Iowa and New Hampshire. So Iowa is sort of one leg of this. I don't think that presidential campaigns are won in Iowa, but they are definitely lost in Iowa. I remember this was the scene of the very famous Howard Dean scream, right, where at the end of this moment he sort of overreads the crowd, which was perfect for politics, but ended up looking like he wasn't in control. You don't want to have that moment. If you lose Iowa, you want to be in control of how you lose, and you want to manage that expectations.
And that's a good example. I mean, I think a good historical analogy is the 2004 race with Howard Dean. He was leading nationally in all the Democratic polls. I think it was leading, in very similar effect to Trump, leading in a lot of the states. The expectation game was he was going to win Iowa. And he ended up finishing, I think, a third or fourth. Because he and Dick Gephardt got into this sort of brawl, for lack of a better word. John Kerry was able to win, and he sort of collapsed going forward. So what you might see is a similar scenario like that. And again, it goes really to turnout. It's all about turnout.
So one last question: do we expect to see anyone end their campaign after Iowa, or is that too early for anyone to call it?
Yeah, I think you might see a couple of. There's a lot of pressure on Rand Paul, for example, to not continue on and concentrate and focus on his race in Kentucky, his reelection bid in Kentucky. There's now a viable Democratic challenger to him. He might, someone like Carly Fiorina, some of the other candidates, Ben Carson, they may or may not. Iowa and New Hampshire are so closely paired together. What historically happens is you see them kind of going in tandem. So I think after New Hampshire, after together, you'll probably see some willowing way of the field on the Republican side. I don't quite know why Martin O'Malley is still in the race at this stage, other than to clearly secure himself a spot as a potential VP for someone, because he clearly hasn't caught fire. Yeah. I guess if he shocks the world and does extremely well in Iowa, that could change things for him. But right now, that's probably what I would say you can expect to see.
Yeah, too low voltage, I think, for O'Malley. He's just simply not catching fire like you need. And, a lot of this is about momentum, especially the rules, I think, are going to create a problem for him. I mean, as we said, the rules require you to give 15% to be able to get to the next level. And there are going to be a lot of places where he just doesn't get that. And that's a pretty big blow to a campaign. So I suspect he'll hang in there, but it won't be much longer. The other thing, too, is on the Republican side, Iowa's made up of 60% of the voters in the Republican primary consider themselves evangelicals. So if you don't see candidates like Huckabee or Santorum or Ben Carson doing well there, where are you going to do well? So I think that then at that point the writing will be on the wall, and they'll start to make some tough choices about how to gracefully end their campaigns.
All right, well, we'll be waiting to see what happens. Thank you guys so much for being with me tonight, and thank you for watching the program. Remember to log on to houstonpublicmedia.org/perspectives every Friday night at 8 p.m. following the 7:30 broadcast of Red, White, and Blue. Thanks so much for watching. See you again next week.